So help me God.
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 Hello, everybody. Welcome to So Help Me Pod. My name is Rob Lee. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Pacific School of Religion. We also have Scott Lee, my brother, with me here today to talk about our nation's sixth president, John Quincy Adams, who lived from 1767 to 1848 and served from 1825 to 1829. He was a Unitarian. So, Scott, what is it like to live in the shadow of something or someone? I know you know that since you're my younger brother. John Quincy Adams undoubtedly asked that question in his lifetime as he reckoned with the death of his brother and then taking on the family business of the American presidency. Only one other person in American history has followed in his father's footsteps in such a way, and that is a more recent president, our 43rd president, George W. Bush, the son of our 41st president, George H.W. Bush. President John Quincy Adams, as we know and already have noted, followed in his father's footsteps, but he did so in a secondary way as well. Like his presidential father, he only served one term in office. This was due to rising populism and the embracing of it by our nation's seventh president, someone we'll talk about in the next episode, President Andrew Jackson. His dad was alive to see him elected president. However, our nation's second first lady, Abigail Adams, was not. She died of tuberculosis a few years earlier. By the presidency of George Washington, Quincy Adams was avoiding politics. He didn't want to be involved. He didn't want to take on his father's business, yet skeptically accepted the role of ambassador to the Netherlands in 1794. This would be followed by an important appointment to the ambassadorship to Portugal. The elder President Adams would win election in 1796 and appoint his son as ambassador to Prussia during his administration. During President Thomas Jefferson's administration, the Massachusetts legislature elected Quincy Adams to the United States Senate, which was probably a really interesting dynamic because obviously Jefferson and Quincy Adams' father had a significant beef. After his term in the Senate ended in 1809, he argued a case before the Supreme Court, and President Madison appointed the experienced diplomat the first United States minister to Russia that same year. After the War of 1812, Madison would subsequently appoint Adams to ambassador to Great Britain to heal the wounds of the recent conflict. In 1817, President James Monroe would enter the White House, and he would ask the ambassador to serve as the Secretary of State, a position he would hold until entering the White House himself as President of the United States. During Quincy Adams' one term in office, his domestic agenda was robust, yet focused on roads, infrastructure, and the interior, much like what we're dealing with today with President Biden and the Build Back Better plan and all these infrastructure goals that the current president have. That was a lot similar to what Quincy Adams was after, a robust domestic policy that was focused on the things that our nation needed to get stuff done. As John Quincy Adams' foreign policy chops were unmatched, unlike any other president we had seen maybe since Jefferson, he greatly expanded American trade and presence on the global scale. President John Quincy Adams was one of those presidents who kind of established the presidency and the United States as a global presence on the world stage. President John Quincy Adams lost in a landslide defeat, however, though, to President Andrew Jackson. It was such a stinging loss and a blow to the sixth president that he chose, like his father before him, to begrudgingly not attend the inauguration of the man who stifled his second-term aspirations. The former president, however, would grow tired and bored in his post-presidency. In his retirement, he was just like, I'm done. I've got to do something. and would be elected to 9 terms in the House of Representatives until his death in 1848. He would be one of 2 presidents to serve in Congress in their post-presidency. President Andrew Johnson, the 17th president, would serve for a short period in the Senate after his presidency. The president and representative would serve faithfully in the House until 1848, when he voted on the House floor, only to collapse due to a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He would die 2 days later after his final vote and collapse. Then a young representative who was greatly influenced by Quincy Adams would attend his funeral, a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. The 6th president would grapple with questions of life and faith after the apparent suicide on a steamboat of his son, George Washington Adams, who died in 1829. And this created a faith and public life issue for Quincy Adams. His faith was founded in the ideas of his father and mother, and he was convicted of his Unitarian faith as the faith of his life and practice. But he would attend church sometimes 3 times a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, one in the afternoon. He was church going. He was like his father. He was a church going animal, as his father described himself. He believed that the Bible was important to daily life and edifying the faithful. Equally, however, he was convinced of the separation of church and state. He would be the first president of the United States to take the presidential oath of office without a Bible used for the oath. He would instead use a book of constitutional law as the foundation of his oath. So you see here this kind of both this passion for faith, but the realization and recognition that faith did not have a place in public life in the same way that other presidents had thought previously or were thinking after him. This may seem this lack of Bible during the oath would be a big issue for us today. I think we could be all over the news. But Quincy Adams' faith was founded elsewhere beyond the tradition he held fast to. As Dr. Gary Scott Smith argues, his faith was central to his conviction, character, and conduct, and strongly influenced his political ideas and practices. He was equal part skeptic and saint, in my opinion. His piety, or lack of correctly expressing religious piety, would play into the rise of populism and the Jacksonian Democrats. They believed that there needed to be more expression of faith than perhaps what Quincy Adams would offer. The subsequent administration led by President Jackson would take separation of church and state to a higher level and turn up the volume on that account. However, that stood in opposition to the understandings and moorings of both the Jacksonians and John Quincy Adams. His faith, his theology, and his rearing led him to a deep and abiding belief in the abolition of chattel slavery on the American continent. And during his time in the House of Representatives, he was a staunch advocate for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in the United States. And this would have, as I said, significant influence on not only our nation's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, but other presidents as well who would serve subsequently following Quincy Adams, and seeing if they were progressive enough to see slavery as a moral evil and something that needed to be dealt with by our nation, that they would be influenced by his work and his beliefs. So this man is a really complicated figure, right? But he's really interesting. I love studying him because there's so much nuance here. It's not an easy thing to really figure out, to crack the code of who Quincy Adams was based on just what you see on the surface. You have to dig deeper than that. So Scott, what questions do you have about our nation's 6th president, John Quincy Adams?
So he was the only person to not swear on a Bible?
No, there were other presidents. Theodore Roosevelt comes to mind. Calvin Coolidge comes to mind. Some of them by circumstance. So, for instance, actually talk about this in a bonus episode about the oath of office. Calvin Coolidge was sworn in Vermont, and was sworn in by his father, a notary public, because Warren Harding had died, and so there was a need to get him in office, and it was quick. Subsequently, in the 1960s, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, on the flight back on Air Force One from Dallas to Washington, D.C., President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on a Roman missal accidentally, which is a Roman prayer book. He was sworn in on a Roman prayer book instead of a Bible because they confused the prayer book with the Bible. But again, it's kind of like, is it the substance of the book or is it the idea of the book itself? And for President Johnson, he kind of pointed out that it didn't matter what was in the book; it was what he believed about the book that mattered to him. And so there's examples of other presidents who have not sworn in on the Constitution, but Quincy Adams was the first.
So since he started the separation of church and state almost, that's what kind of led into the next like Andrew Jackson movement. And if so, like, did he know that that was coming? And I mean, he got beat by Andrew Jackson. So if he started it, then was it a pendulum swing that made this happen? Like it was going from one side straight to the other?
Well, actually, it's really interesting. So obviously, we know that separation of church and state was around prior to John Quincy Adams, but this notion of a robust version of a separation of church and state was really played out in Quincy Adams' administration. Andrew Jackson would take it to a new level, and even more so. We'll talk about that in the next episode about how he viewed faith in public life. But it seemed like the populists who supported Andrew Jackson kind of wanted more faith. So it seemed like they didn't get what they wanted, even in Andrew Jackson. But again, we'll talk about Jackson in the next episode. John Quincy Adams was deeply concerned with the notion that what he was believing should not have an impact on anyone else and their beliefs or ability to move throughout this nation and have agency, which is something we should really value, especially if you're someone who may be Roman Catholic or Jewish or Muslim in this country. The gifts of the separation of church and state mean that the minority, the people who are in the minority, should be afforded, and we should strive to afford them the same rights and privileges of the majority faith. Right now, despite the decline in people of faith, Christianity remains the majority religion of the United States. That said, there's plenty of nuance to that, but we should, as Christians and as people of the United States, afford the rights that are afforded to us and privileges and understandings and all of that should be afforded to everyone else as well. And that was kind of the main gist of what Quincy Adams was trying to say.
Next to last question. What is the religious landscape at this moment?
So it's interesting, right? The religious landscape is that we are in the midst of what would be called the Second Great Awakening, which is a period of robust religious fervor in the United States and across the world. We see the idea that there are things coming to pass that would make, think about it, as the country begins its march westward. We've already had the Louisiana Purchase in Thomas Jefferson's term. So the country is beginning to expand and expand at a great pace. So there's a need for a religiosity and a conversation about religious lexicon during that time. This led in large part to a Second Great Awakening of religious experience in the United States. And the Quincy Adams tenure was not immune to that. It's interesting, for instance, one of the things that we start to see, and this was probably later, but still part of the Second Great Awakening, and this time was the establishment of the Christian flag that you've seen, the white flag with the blue field and the red cross. That was started in large part during the westward expansion as we're starting to see the nation move out west. You probably couldn't carry a brass cross with you to put in your church. So the flag stood as a placeholder for that brass cross. So you see how these things are starting to expand and take shape in a way that we would later see in further administrations and then later history as part of what was going on.
And then my last question is the difference between, I guess, parties at this point. Are they populist parties yet? I remember that back in something like that, but I don't really remember what's happening right now. Like, is it Republican, Democrat, a different form of that? Go ahead and answer that one.
So this is actually a period of great tumult and upheaval in political parties. The Jacksonians, which would become kind of the Jacksonian Democrats, which would really, I mean, you kind of have to think about how this it kind of flipped later on. Jackson was very much a modern day kind of Republican, maybe libertarian, whereas Quincy Adams would be considered a modern day Democrat, liberal, progressive, federalist kind of person. Again, there's nuance to that, right? Like that's just painting over with broad strokes. But that said, this idea of political parties was really coming into shape as the Whigs and other parties were either falling apart or coming together, coalescing with other parties. National Republicans and the Jacksonian, these Democrats. So you can see that the parties are part of the conversation, but they're a different part of the conversation than what we would see later on, especially towards the time that we get to the Party of Lincoln and other parties that were starting to shift and change. And even the Republican Party of Lincoln was more federalist than the party of today's Republican Party. So you can see how it shifts based on time and all of that and issues too. So President John Quincy Adams was a force to be reckoned with on the landscape of American democracy. His convictions led him to the belief that they were out of vogue in the 19th century. Those beliefs, based largely on his theological underpinnings, could be considered a culprit for his election loss in 1828. His speaking up and speaking out in his post-presidency makes him even more consequential as a president. He could be compared to the 39th president of the modern era, someone we will also talk about on our podcast, President Jimmy Carter, who had a much more consequential post-presidency than that of a presidential term. So, Scott, what's up next? Where are we going next? We will square off with one of our more difficult eras of the American experiment, and one of the darkest, too. The president who immediately took office after Quincy Adams was a populist demagogue that forced the relocation and subjugation of nearly 50,000 Native Americans. We will discuss our nation's seventh president, President Andrew Jackson, on the next episode. And with that, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. As always, we hope you check out our database, which you can hear about in our outro, and find a way to plug in to this great podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been listening to So Help Me Pod, a podcast of Beloved Journal in conjunction with Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. The podcast is offered in partial completion of the Doctor of Ministry degree for the Reverend Robert W. Lee. All opinions and insights offered are solely owned by that of those who offered them and do not reflect the views of stakeholders in the project. There have been 45 men and 46 presidential administrations. All of them unique. Some of them have been more interesting than others, some of them more terrifying than others. All have been part of the grand expression of democracy on the North American continent and part of the wider conversation of self-governance in the world. These men have failed profoundly, and we have failed profoundly in following their leadership along with our own sometimes antiquated and backwards ways of viewing and acting in the world. That said, this form of leadership is unlike few other, and the greatest gift we have has been given in the ways in which the American experiment continues to prosper despite our terrible misgivings. We are better off because of these men, and we are forever in their debt. For more information, visit www.roblee4.com/presidents.